Welcome to another video. Today is the 10th of January, and I'm just going to be giving some updates about the situation in Klishchiivka, Bakhmut, Soledar. So before I get into that, please like and subscribe. But yeah, I want to work my way from the west to the east. So I will make some timestamps in order to make it easy for anybody who's more concerned about the situation in Soledar. And so I'm going to start out with Klishchiivka just to give an update from there. We have seen some advances by the Russians over recent days. This didn't necessarily happen today. It really added up over the past week or so. You had Russian troops over here and some of the DPR units. They were advancing from Klishchiivka and Zelenopilia towards the Ukrainian fortifications around the canal. You have this bush line over here, and you have this road over here. And as you go further up north, you have these fortifications that were built up over the past 8 years. And so this is where a lot of Ukrainian troops are now stationed, trying to hold the line. And it is a very tough nut to crack. You don't want to assault these fortifications on head on. And as we've been going on in times past by, the Russians have been methodically clearing out a lot of these bush lines over here, and they've very steadily advanced onto the current line that we see over here, which is based around this road, which is pretty close to Klishchiivka. Now from here, they're sort of trying to fix the Ukrainian positions because now they're at a very close range and they can fire upon the Ukrainian positions in these trenches. And so they can't really maneuver that much. They're just stuck in here in this, really you could say, like cross-shelling and just firing back and forth between one another. That's what's really going on over here. I don't expect to see the Russians try to assault it head-on unless the Ukrainians retreat from here. And then they would, of course, try to take over these positions. You have this really large fortified area over here, and then you have this one over here, which is a bit smaller. But you could still see how there are really some trench lines over here. There are also vehicle revetments. And then moving further north, this is all part of a broader strategy to envelop Klishchiivka, just like they tried to envelop Soledar, and they were successful. They're also trying to envelop Klishchiivka. And so, yeah, they're strengthening the southern flank, and they're putting pressure on the eastern part of the town, which is why we're seeing a lot of this fighting now reach the eastern outskirts of the town. I'm sure that you have some Wagner group soldiers that are actually fighting in the houses right now, although for the most part, Ukraine does retain control of most of the settlement. From the north, this is really the most concerning part of the front line in Klishchiivka for the Ukrainians, because the Russians over the past few weeks have been clearing out the Ukrainian positions to the north of Klishchiivka. They've reached the train line over here, and from there they took over the train station, and they were able to take over some of the houses in the northern part of the settlement. So from here they do have, you could say, a bridgehead, I guess, within the town, and from there they could apply pressure onto the Ukrainian positions and fix them in their current positions so they can't maneuver that much, because if you move around to try to deal with some other gaps in the front line, then you will create new ones on the most pressing part of the front line. And so this is giving now Russia the opportunity to maneuver through these forests over here, through these open fields, and flank the main Ukrainian fortifications in Klishchiivka from the north. So let's zoom in on that. You can see over here, there are some huge fortifications. I've talked about them ad nauseum at this point. And this is where the Ukrainians are expecting to retreat to once they lose Klishchiivka. So that might happen in a matter of days or maybe in a matter of weeks. But once they do lose Klishchiivka, I'm sure that they will be trying to set up positions over here in order to prevent a further loss of land, because at this point, there's nowhere else for the Ukrainians to retreat besides to Ivanivske. And if Ivanivske falls, then that's it for Bakhmut, because the situation in the north is already difficult enough, and I'm going to get into that. But if the situation in terms of communication and cohesion between Chasiv Yar, Konstantinivka, and Bakhmut gets disrupted in a significant manner, then there's really no way to hold on to Bakhmut. It's going to become untenable. So that's why the Ukrainians are fighting so hard in Klishchiivka. But despite that fact, the Russians are starting to envelop the town. They're fixing the Ukrainian positions over here. And so we're going to have to see what happens. But for now, the situation is not looking good in Klishchiivka. In Bakhmut, I would say that the situation hasn't changed that much since I've last talked about places like Opitny. Really, the front line is pretty stable over here. The Ukrainians have been able to stabilize the front line by withdrawing from Opitny, and now you have really just static fighting, you could say, in the southern outskirts of Bakhmut, trying to push in towards the Bakhmut dam, but I don't see that happening right now. Also, again, pretty static in the residential blocks. There is a possibility that the Wagner Group has been able to push in towards the Ivana Franka streets, and so the front line may look more like this, but either way, these are pretty marginal gains, and you're just seeing house-to-house fighting. There's also some really ambiguity about what's going on at the art winery. I've seen some reports that Ukraine is attacking over there, but for now I'm going to keep it under Russian control because they control the industrial area. And then when we go up, it's now confirmed basically that the DPR troops, along with the Russian soldiers using their positions at the gas station, were able to take over these positions in northeastern Bakhmut. These are some of the outskirts, so you could see that the blocks over here aren't that tightly packed compared to an area like this, so it is relatively easy to take it over. And now the Russians have some positions within this northernmost district to enter the residential area from the north, which again helps in enveloping the city of Bakhmut. So this is a part of the Miaso-Kombinat district, and the Miaso-Kombinat district is the northernmost one. Now the Russians, using their positions in Pidhorodne, could also fire upon the Ukrainian positions within the town of Bakhmut. Another issue that is presented by the taking of Pidhorodne is that now the Russians will have the opportunity to strike the main supply hub from the north, which is transporting reinforcements and supplies into Bakhmut. So you can see how there's this huge train station over here, and there's a road leading into here. There's another road a bit further to the west. So you can see there are several roads that are being utilized by the Ukrainians. And all of them can now be fired upon by the Russians at pretty close quarters. And what will make the situation even worse is the fact that this hill over here has been taken by the Russians. There is some ambiguity as to whether they fully control it or as to whether the Ukrainians are still putting up some resistance over here, but it is being cleared out, that's for sure. And once it is fully cleared, it could be used to, fire mortars and just fire upon the supply lines over here. And so that's an issue for all the Ukrainian garrison over here. It's an issue for obviously the logistical situation. So they're going to have to try to combat that in some way. One idea that I have is in terms of the broader line that is now being fired upon because Russians have the high ground to the east, is that the Ukrainians should try to utilize their high ground to the west. So in some of these areas, now that I'm going to go up, I'm going to talk about it, the Ukrainians do actually have some higher ground to the west of these roads. And so they can use this in theory to try to cover for the Ukrainian convoys as they pass by through this road over here from Seversk, for instance, into Bakhmut, or from the E40 highway, which I think is leading in from Slavyansk and Kramatorsk into Bakhmut. Now, in regards to Pidhorodne, basically everybody's in agreement that it is under Russian control. I've been looking at Ukrainian sources. Their maps show that it's under Russian control, which is why I've marked it as fully under Russian control. They've also talked about the fact that there was really only one road that could be used by the Ukrainians to retreat out of the town, the road which is over here. And so they were fired upon by the Russians, and they suffered a huge amount of casualties in the retreats. Although they were able to get out many of their units in time, I do have to move this unit in particular, the 115th Brigade. They were moved out. They're probably around this train station right now, trying to regroup and form a defensive line. Same could be said about Klishchiivka. The Ukrainians are preparing a defensive line over here because of the situation in Krasnohora. It really is untenable to hold on to Krasnohora at this point because the Russians have already infiltrated. They were able to easily take the orchards, and now they're entering the residential part of this settlement. And they've been using the heights to the east and to the south to help them and aid them in this advance, so they have cover. And meanwhile, the main Ukrainian fortified positions are to the north, where they're really just fixed in one position trying to defend. They can't really use these positions offensively. And so that's the issue, because the Russians are just not attacking those positions head on yet. They're attacking the settlement, and then once they have full control of the settlement, they'll be able to turn their focus to the north and overrun these two strongholds. So let's zoom in. We see there is a Ukrainian stronghold over here. I've talked about it before. And then I found another one a bit to the north as well. Smaller, but still, nonetheless, it is a stronghold. So these need to be overrun. And you can notice how these were not touched in the recent Russian advance. So they're just leaving the Ukrainians fixed in their positions over here as they try to advance in a nearby sector. And this presents a threat to the Ukrainian supply lines from this road because they're very, very close to taking Krasnohora, and then there will be zero way to supply Pidhorodne through this road. And it will also make it difficult to supply through the Seversk road, which is also pretty close. Although, if you can see over here, this area that I'm circling, it is on higher ground, so it could be used as cover, as I said. But again, you just have to have artillery duels between the Russian positions to the eastern heights and the Ukrainian positions in the western heights. So that's the situation in Krasnohora. It is contested. Pidhorodne is not contested yet, but once the Russians are able to get full control of these open fields over here and they reach the road, take over the Soledar lake, which shouldn't take that much time, it could even happen tomorrow, then they will be able to reach Pidhorodne, and this will effectively cut off the communication between the Soledar garrison, which is now retreating out of Soledar, and the Bakhmut garrison. And it will also give the Russians a good position to attack Klishchiivka from the north. Now, moving on to the situation in Soledar. I want to try to talk about the situation in Soledar in chronological order if it's possible, because I made my video yesterday, so not that much has happened, because usually I'm uploading videos like every 2-3 days. I'm trying to make these videos on a daily basis now because of the recent changes. And so, yeah, we did have a lot of changes that we have to get into. So, let's start off with the fact that in the beginning of the morning, and I'm not saying morning in Eastern time, morning for the Russians and Ukrainians, morning in Bakhmut. Starting around dawn, you could say, the Ukrainians, they began their retreat from the defensive line that they had set up in the northern part of the city around the center, the city center. You can see that this is roughly what they were planning to use as their defensive line, trying to guard the flanks from both sides and then put a lot of emphasis on the center. And that's the issue, because they didn't really have that much of an emphasis on the north and south, especially, you could say, the north. Then they were easily flanked, especially as the Russians had the momentum and were able to take over the high ground over here. They were able to take over Yurchina Gora, and from there they were able to fire upon the Ukrainian positions in the city center and take over the hospital. And from there, as the day went on, the Wagner group was able to take over other not industrial, but residential sectors. They were able to reach salt mine number 4. Salt mine number 4 is over here. So right now, you could say that it's basically under Russian control, so I need to change the map. And so they took over that salt mine. Salt mines 1 through 3 are now completely under control. There's no doubt about that. And they forced the Ukrainian troops that were able to escape from the retreat to go back to the line over here based on this road. And so the only part of Soledar that is completely under Ukrainian control right now is the part that is disconnected from the main part of Soledar. It's like basically its own island, you could say. This is the part of Soledar that I'm talking about. It's really centered around the Sol train station, which is in the center. And now you have a lot of Ukrainian troops regrouping over there. A lot of the units that were able to escape, a lot of the platoons, squads that were able to make it out alive, they're now sheltered over here trying to prevent another collapse of the front line. And so they now have a bit of breathing room as the Wagner group mops up the center of the city of Soledar. Now this is where I want to get into the very interesting fact and what the name of the video is really about. You can see that it was a very unorganized retreat because the Ukrainians, after their first rout in the southern part of the front line, they were never able to establish communications again between all the units. They were never able to cohesively work together and set up another front line. People thought they were able to once the Russians reached the salt mines, but this was very temporary and it was in isolated areas. And if they were to have worked together, they would have been able to secure the flanks. And so, no, this is not an orderly retreat. You could say maybe for some units it is, but for others, they were not able to make it out in time just because of the sheer bulk of Ukrainian forces. You can't really get that many people out on these narrow roads without Russia noticing. You can't get them out discreetly from houses. And so really the only way to retreat effectively is in small groups. So yeah, some small groups were able to make it out. Others couldn't. And so most of the ones that couldn't are in this general polygon, which I've made over here. Although I'm sure that over the past few hours, the Wagner Group has began to clean it out, because the Wagner Group announced, it was now like 5.5 hours ago, that in midnight Russian time, that would be the last chance of the Ukrainians to surrender. So if they didn't surrender by then, it was basically an ultimatum. We're just going to clear you out, take you as POWs, and we would fight. We'd fight. If you don't put your arms down, we're going to fight, and we're going to take you out. That was basically his threat. And to my knowledge, there was no surrenders, at least no notable surrenders by the Ukrainian forces. And so right now, there's probably a mopping up operation going on in the city center. In terms of the amount of Ukrainian troops that are left in here, I've seen numbers thrown around like 400, 300, 200. I'm inclined to believe probably like 200, 300. It makes sense. It wouldn't be that many because, first of all, a lot of them died. Second of all, a lot of them were able to make it out in small groups. And we know this because a lot of them are now sheltered in the train station. But others obviously were not, because you could see this in Russian maps that part of Soledar is still contested. All of them virtually agree that Soledar has not been taken completely yet, but that it is being mopped up. And it could only be mopped up if there are vestiges of the Ukrainian military still present in here. And so that's what's going on right now. We have a lot of footage recently that I've added, although now the situation has changed. I don't know how important these geolocations are. You have over here the Wagner Group. They were filmed near the administrative building, although I don't think there's any footage of them in the administrative building itself yet. They are outside of school number 14, so they are pretty close to it, and that was filmed a few hours ago, so it's possible that they took it over by now. We also have here some house-to-house fighting in Soledar. This might have been from yesterday when the Ukrainians were present in this area, but since then this government office has been taken over. We also have some footage from the Soledar mine, which is now taken over by Russia, some Soledar mine number 4. As for Soledar mine number 7, this is still under Ukrainian control, and so this might be Ukrainians might be trying to regroup in this area as well. You have a lot of units that made it out that could potentially be used. Although they have been battered and they are fatigued, they might be forced to just try to stay strong for just a few more weeks to prevent another breakthrough. So you have all these units over here that were involved in the Battle of Soledar. Now I have them on the outskirts. And you can see basically that the pocket is being closed. That's all I have to say about Soledar specifically, but you can see how Russia's expanded their control using the northern flank to attack the open fields, take over some of these isolated blocks, take over some of the forested belts, and then use those positions to attack the last remaining stronghold in Soledar, the Sol train station, which is now being attacked head-on, first of all, but I'm sure it'll also be attacked from a flanking position. Maybe from the south it will be attacked. And so, yeah, you're going to see battles shifting towards here right now. You're also going to see battles in this suburb of Soledar as well. You might see them in Pidhorodne in the coming days. In terms of the units that were affected the most, I would say that the 46th Brigade, they were moved in a few days ago to try to stabilize the front line. They probably suffered very heavy losses. You could see this is the 46th Air Assault Brigade. They were sent in at really the climax of the battle, and they were tasked with the house-to-house fighting, trying to prevent the Russians from breaking through. And so I'm sure that they suffered many casualties. They were able to make it out. They said on Telegram that they did incur a lot of casualties, though, so we know for sure that is the case, although I don't have any specific numbers. We also know that from the Wagner Group, they've posted patches of some of the insignia and such that was captured from the Ukrainians in the retreat. And so in those images, it's interesting because you could see that there were patches from the 14th Brigade, which I thought was fighting in northern Luhansk, but I guess they have some brigades that are also, or some battalions, sorry, that are fighting in Soledar. They might have been moved in because this is a more pressing issue, trying to stabilize the front line in Soledar. There's also the 3rd Tank Brigade, 17th Tank Brigade. So these tank brigades are not actually like using tanks most of the time. They do obviously have tank battalions. They also have artillery battalions, and they have mechanized infantry battalions. So a lot of those units are the ones that are doing the work on the ground. But you do have some Ukrainian tanks that were engaging Russian infantry, but they aren't that effective. Sometimes when the Russians are trying to like play hit and run tactics with them, and then in the open fields, a lot of the time they got routed by the Russian tanks, just due to the fact that they had first of all, less control over the flanks, and because they didn't have superior numbers in terms of the amount of tanks that they had. So that's the situation really around Soledar. In terms of the tunnels, I do want to mention that because I do think it's interesting, and I was thinking that there probably wouldn't be that much resistance in the tunnels because the Ukrainians didn't have that much time to build it up. They really started at least knowing or preparing for the Battle of Soledar in April. And so they did have a few months to build it up. It's not the same thing as Azovstal, and it doesn't really function the same way where it's like a steel factory underground. It's more of just like a salt mining plant, and so it's not the same thing. Although you could store weapons and stuff in there, and so you probably do have some Ukrainian troops lingering in there trying to hide from the Russians. The Russians are now mopping it up. We have images of them, of the Wagner group located within the salt mines. And it's basically agreed upon by everyone now. You could see in the images, it looks like the salt mine based on the boundaries on the sides. It just looks like the same interior design. Also, there's like little salt fragments on the floor, so you could tell that it's basically the salt mine. I did see some claims that it was a gypsum plant from Pidhorodne, but this is probably not the case based on the images and juxtaposing it to the actual images of the salt mine itself. And so we know the Wagner group at least has some presence in the tunnels right now. So the thing is that the tunnels are 200 kilometers. It's really 200 kilometers worth of tunnels. And so these extend over a wide array of areas. Not just under Soledar, but they really do extend to some of these, at least underground, these open fields over here, Krasnohora, Bakhmutske. They go all around this general area. And so I'm sure that some Ukrainians use the tunnels to actually retreat. And because there are a few shafts that they still control, like the number 7 mine, they could still theoretically use it, although I'm not sure how many people are in there, especially as Wagner continues to mop it up. I'm not going to say they have full control of the tunnels, but they are trying to quickly neuter the threat of the salt mines in order to prevent some sort of attack on the rear later on. And so that's really the situation right now in Soledar. Thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you